Welcome back to Varn Vlog. And you can tell the timing because my hair changes and my face changes, and I shave my face and look a lot more like Oliver Platt. And that's going to indicate, actually, for those of you who are following this, that we are recording beyond the election of 2024, and Trump is now president again. Now, I'm not here to make a huge amount of discussion about that. Right now, people are spending their reels on predictions basing off of cabinet appointments and whatnot. And the cabinet appointments that Trump has given are going to make everyone uncomfortable. Trump, like Biden, is a coalitional president, although it's a coalition of different kinds of rent-seeking, often grifters and weirdos and media figures versus career bureaucrats. But ultimately, it's both rent-seeking. And while this is going to come out probably in February of 2025, I am recording this towards the end of November of 2024. And so my thoughts are in that mode. I'm also spending a lot more time working on a book and have slowed down production. And I'm going to be honest with you, I might even slow these solos down to 2 a month as opposed to 4. I'll make that decision depending on how I feel. Both health issues have come up. It's part of why I shave my face. And I am thinking more and more about the direction of the show. On 300 episodes of the regular podcast, we're going to be finally ending season 1, which was a 3-year season, and going into season 2. And I'm thinking about becoming more eclectic, which is what the promise of the show originally was anyway. And that brings me to today, because today we're talking about sovereignty and the useless as we deal with the kind of shift from wonktopic in decline Bonapartism that people tried to build the Biden administration up into, to grift-topic in decline Bonapartism that people are predicting the Trump administration will be. Both of these are an attempt at some classical notion of sovereignty, and both people are frustrated with the norms and processes of bureaucratic elites. One is more favorable to those elite, but there is a fundamental continuity of certain policies while there's going to be discontinuity of others, and that's almost a meaningless statement to say. But we don't know what all that's going to be, so let's think about the nature of what sovereignty is, going back to this series we've been doing kind of on Hobbes, and we're going to incorporate Bataille into this one, believe it or not, and see where it goes. Now, we can dig into Hobbes a ton, and the primary text here is interesting, but since I don't want to really overburden you with early modern English, we're going to look at Alan Ryan's On Hobbes, Escaping the War of All Against All, which is a supplement to his On Politics book, which you see back there on my shelf. There's a number of faces back there on my shelf. There's Primo Levi, there's Beckett, and there is the On Politics book. There's also all the other books in the background. Anyway, but this is where we're going to go. We're on page 88. And let's get into this. The covenant that takes us out of the state of nature is a covenant of every man with every man to transfer all their rights to this man or this body of men, and to take his or their word as law. So sovereign can be individual or collective, but it is still sovereign when we transfer all our rights to that sovereign to have the rights be bestowed back upon us at the sovereign's will. Except for one right. Hobbes gives us the right to life, which actually, funny, the bourgeois state does not give us, but nonetheless. This institutes a sovereign. The sovereign is an artificial body. Think of the king's 2 bodies. Recall the front piece of Leviathan. Yep, the king made out of a composite of the state. And as an artificial person, like a corporation, it represents us all, and we are the authors of its acts. So this idea that the state is us, even in Hobbes's undemocratic form, because of the social contract of which we build the state, which again is mythic. There is no moment of the actual social contract. We see very clearly that this idea that we are the state really begins in the English parlance of thinking about politics with Hobbes, not with Locke or some of the later figures. Hobbes devotes a lot of detailed explanation to this point, as he needs to do in order to bring about a claim that looks very much like squaring the circle. Previous writers who defended the absolute monarchy agreed that in extremis, kings were excessively unjust and therefore have become tyrants, might be deposed. Hobbes claims that the sovereign could not commit injustice because its acts are literally ours. Again, we see this game that Hobbes plays. Remember, Hobbes says if you submit to the sovereign rationally, you've given up your rights, and if you don't submit to the sovereign, you are trying to stay in a state of nature, which is inherently irrational. Thus, you have also given up your rights because you're not rational. It's a double bind. We have the same double bind here. We are the state, and we have empowered the sovereign through this mythic act of social contract, which means that we cannot be committed injustices against, except in the case of trying to end our lives. That's it. That's the only thing that does it. It was not to say that whoever bears the sovereignty cannot behave badly. He might perpetuate inequity and violate the laws of nature and of God. Hobbes still believed in natural law. Strictly speaking, however, he cannot act unjustly, a point Hobbes reinforces by insisting that it should be unlawful to talk about tyranny at all. No doubt thinking that from discussing the nature of tyranny, it would be a short step to advocating tyrannicide, which he had lived through in the English Civil Wars. That's me adding that, but it's just a bit of context, which Alan added earlier. Alan Ryan added earlier. He has two first names. Anyway. Hobbes's attention to the institution of the sovereign is justified. Although almost all sovereigns, in fact, acquire authority over their subjects by acquisition, and Hobbes actually admits this elsewhere, institutions underlie the existence of all sovereigns, and people made up the institutions of which the sovereigns could acquire, at least according to Hobbes's way of thinking. Hobbes understood this and acknowledged that there is a sense in which democracy underpins even absolute monarchy, asterisks. And there is some truth to this, I think, if we see the way like autocracies are actually just as concerned about public opinion and the possibility of absolute revolts as democracies are. In fact, in some ways, they're more concerned about it because the diffusions against violence are just not there. That sense is that there is no legal system unless all, or at least the vast majority, accept the requirements as obligatory. The details of Hobbes' accounts of the sovereign institution excite curiosity and skepticism. Critics have wondered why Hobbes said that covenants without the sword are but words and of no power to hold a man at all, and yet relied on a covenant without the sword to create the sovereign who was to wield the sword. Once the covenant establishing the sovereign has been entered into, it's maintaining by the sword of the sovereign. The difficulty is reaching that point. It is crucial to Hobbes that the sword does not create the obligation imposed by the covenant. I create the obligation that binds me when I covenant. The role of the sword, that is, the sovereign's power to compel me, is to remove any excuse for non-performance. I am bound by my agreement, even if I didn't make it. You are bound by your agreement. You may wonder whether I will meet my obligations if no external power can make me do so. And I may wonder that the same thing about you. If we are each ready to meet our obligations, the knowledge that there's a sword to ensure that the other party performs removes the excuse not to do so, not to do what we are willing to do by being in the covenant. The sword can remain in its sheath. Its bare existence achieves what is needed. Second, what sustains government is the readiness of its citizenry to support it so long as it is not too dangerous. That is a moral, not legal commitment. And that is what the covenant of all with all amounts to. This is actually an extension of like feudal covenantry, which is a moral and legal commitment, but it is a moral commitment first. We don't think about bourgeois law doesn't work this way. So this part of Hobbes seems somewhat alien to us, even though he is the inventor of a lot of the ways of thinking, or at least the codifier of a lot of the ways of thinking that modern bourgeois societies justify themselves with. Hobbes was preoccupied with the thought that one person or body of persons must be sovereign. That is, to be the unique source of law in a political community. If there is no obedience to law, and liberals still talk about this in rule of law, we must know what the law is, and someone must have the last word on that, which good luck on that. And the United States, that's basically the Supreme Court, not even the presidency. Hobbes regarded theories of the divided sovereignty as disastrous. Yeah, he wouldn't like America. And this was a popular refrain among the defenders of absolute monarchy. The thought of what we settle on a person or a group as a focus of obedience and obey them because everyone else obeys them is not implausible, nor is the argument that if it is to be the source of ultimate authority here on earth, it must be absolute, at least in the sense of owing no superior and having no legal constraint on what it can do. It opens the door to the thought common in writers of the Republican persuasion, but entirely alien to Hobbes. In the Republican tradition, founders of states play a special role. How a state begins is decisive for its future health and longevity, and the founding father or fathers correspondingly important. Hobbes has no time for such questions. He is explaining what a state is and what underpins the claim of a sovereign to absolute authority. Its longevity hinges not on its origins, but on everyone who matters understanding what a commonwealth is and what that means for his obligation to support it. The thought that underlying our vertical allegiance to this or that ruler, Charles I or Cromwell, there must be a horizontal alliance to our fellow citizens is decidedly modern and egalitarian thought. Perhaps it is true, and in fact, that creating a state depends on finding a charismatic founder. But what is true in the logic is unless we have some source of authority entitled to lay down the law and enforce it, we have no state at all, only anarchy, at least for Hobbes. We have a footnote, so we might want to look at on this one. The footnote is not in here. Okay. Actually, no, it probably is just not there. No, that is from reviewing conclusions from Hobbes. Hobbes envisioned two sorts of sovereign, although the attention he bestowed on them was in reverse proportion to their occurrence in the world. The sovereign by institution is the sovereign authority created out of the state of nature, while the sovereign by acquisition is the existent sovereign acquiring new subjects. The second case covers the silent, continuous acquisition of new subjects that takes place as young people become old enough for their allegiance to concern an existing government. It also covers, more importantly for Hobbes, the case where persons defeated in war are spared on the condition of subjecting themselves to a new ruler. Making the leap from the state of nature into political conditions is more intellectually demanding matter, but Hobbes lavished equal ingenuity on both. The sovereign by acquisition offers the person who may or may not become a subject a simple choice, obedience or death. Hobbes argued that in this case, a promise extorted by force is valid. What is normally invalidates a promise to pay a substantial sum the next day to the highwayman offers you your money or your life is in fact that his activity is legally prohibited, and the justified fear that he will kill you if you turn up. The sovereign can spare your life very easily, and when he has done, he has fulfilled his side of the bargain, leaving you no excuse but to fulfill yours. Hobbes insisted that the bargain is made freely. His argument that a promise made out of fear is binding is not wholly unpersuasive. We do not think that a customer who buys bread from a baker need not pay his bill just because he was afraid of going hungry. I mean, although Marx makes that point. Why should we think a defeated enemy is excused from obeying his captor just because he was anxious not to be killed? Fear of privation and fear of death are equally fear of coming to a nasty end. And in fact, Hobbes tries to be too clever. Many conditions make bargains more or less coercive and therefore more or less binding. The situation that there is one baker in town, famine threatens, and the baker offers us to feed us only if we become his slaves is very different from the usual situation where there are many bakers, and the worst that happens is we do not like his bread or his prices is a walk to another baker. The sovereign by acquisition in the first situation rather than the second. The claim to which all that is preamble is that the sovereign is not bound by any promise to his or their subjects. Hobbes has nothing but contempt for theories of mixed government, and for those who thought that the king's coronation oath constituted the sort of promise that someone else might legitimately try to enforce. It is essential to Hobbes' theory that we give up all rights we can transfer to the sovereign. We cannot give up the right to save our own lives in extremis, so there's no point in trying. All other rights are transferred. Interesting, though, that Hobbes thinks those rights are real because he still believes in natural law. So if people wonder where Locke gets it, he's actually getting it from Hobbes in some ways. Not just Hobbes, also Thomas Aquinas and other people. The sovereign by acquisition is under no obligation to us because he fulfilled his role of the bargain when he spared our lives, and he has no further obligation to us. Hobbes took a strikingly individualistic view about obligation. We are under an obligation to obey rulers because we have put ourselves under that obligation. Unlike traditionalists and conservatives, Hobbes does not think we are born into obedience. Most people assent silently to the government and power and society in which they are born, but in logic, the sovereign might legitimately treat them as enemies until they explicitly engage to obey him. The sovereign's forbearance is to be understood as terms for obedience. Having elaborated the nature of the sovereign and its intellectual origins, Hobbes went on to give us an account of the powers and duties of the sovereign and the nature of life under law. That account has many particularities, but its main feature is not a particularity, but central to the accounts of sovereignty for the next several centuries. The point of the sovereign's existence is to settle the question of what law is in some particular jurisdiction. What the sovereign commands as law is law. The sovereign's laws may be well judged or ill judged, but what makes them laws is not their goodness, but their being commanded as rules to guide the subjects to them. This is a pedigree theory of law because it claims that the way to discover what a purported law really is really a law is to see whether or not it has been laid down in the right way by the appropriate authority. For this to be possible, Hobbes thought, the sovereign must be one, indivisible, and absolute. The reason is obvious enough. A decisive answer to the question of what the law is requires an authority able to answer the question. There can be only one such authority, since if there is more than one, we might give conflicting answers. See the United States. The existence of the United States of America suggests other possibilities, one of which is that the sovereign is not what Hobbes says, since the United States possesses a multiplicity of legal systems and no single fiber arbiter of conflict, or that the possession of an identifiable sovereign is not a necessary condition of there being a single state, since the United States is a single political system, but different bodies that have the last word on different issues. Hobbes had no doubt that divided sovereignty was disastrous, but once he had defended absolute authority as essential to the state's existence, he gave an account of how a state could in fact be governed that made so many concessions to the constitutionalist ideas that many commenters have described Hobbes as a proto-liberal, if not a liberal. The awkwardness is that most liberals think citizens have rights against their government, such as a right to free speech, to the free practice of whatever religion seems compelling to them, to the immunities against arbitrary arrest and ill treatment we see enshrined in the Bill of Rights. Hobbes, however, insisted that subjects have no such rights. Natural rights we are born with are useless in the state of nature. We all give them up, except the right to save our lives in extremis, to create a government that will protect us all. So Hobbes' theory of government is just basically a theory of life preservation, which assumes atomized individuals and obligations are also duplicately atomized. The division of government is impossible because you need an individual, or at least an institutional individual. So even if there is more than one person acting as sovereign, they have to be in a solitary institution to settle these questions, because otherwise laws are decided based on differing interpretations and even differing legal authorities. Hobbes would find the United States monstrous. This gets us into a little bit of interesting bit, and we are talking from a book called The Age of Revolt, which is responding to André Breton and Albert Camus. Camus, excuse me, not Camus. I just flashed back to 9th grade when I used to mispronounce Albert Camus' name. Anyway, so we are in section 7, and this is called Revolt, Sovereignty, the Criminal, and Rebellion Against the Character of Royalty, which I feel like Foucault may have ripped off, but we'll come back to that. It is a question of establishing a value founded on revolt and using it to give us a basis to traditional law, which condemns falsehood and demands from us loyalty towards others. Of course, justice itself is implied in the morality defined by this value. Words like revolt, loyalty, and justice are not without ambivalence. And I would like to show that the fundamental requirement of such morality is sovereignty. We see Bataille leaning the Hobbesian way. Thus, the morality of revolt, which, as we shall see, lays the foundation for justice, would nevertheless not be based on it. Its foundation is the will to exist in a sovereign way. This does not clearly emerge, or at least not straight away, from Camus' book. Moreover, I must recognize the proposition in itself is not so clear. I will now endeavor not only to prove it, but give it its everyday meaning. When Camus talks about what the motivation of revolt, this is ambiguous. At first, this motivation seems to be injustice and suffering that results from it, but Albert Camus seems by no means a stranger to pity, but we still need to know what this suffering is that is the object of pity. He rightly says, revolt is born of the exhibition of irrationality in the face of unjustly and incomprehensible conditions. But equally, he can state, revolt is a refusal with a man to be treated as a thing. No, this is actually important for Bataille. Bataille really hates reification. See the recursive share. Treated as a thing signifies in Kant's vocabulary as a means, not an ends. This refusal possibly to express itself by a demand that within the revolt is the will to be sovereign, to belong to oneself and no one else. Albert Camus is not the only person to see the great tide of challenge which has been rising from 2 centuries as being inspired by the demand for sovereignty. Marx established that alienation of the proletariat as a principle of class struggle, but this fundamental element is veiled. As a rule, sovereignty and autonomy of existence are abstract formulas. That's important. More material satisfactions are generally considered more important. If it is a question of freedom, this is because the familiar image of the great word immediately evokes like prison and repression. It is not that the sovereign inevitably has to be abstract, but to the extent that the common representation is connected to it, it is not popular. Above all else, sovereignty is realized in the fact of divinity or of kings. Sovereignty of the people remains an unreal statement. It means that the sovereignty of laboring people is submitting to work. Sovereignty is defined by the fact that it refuses submission and is above all the fact of an existing in the world with no end other than to exist. This is in contradiction not with the work to come or is already achieved, but with current work, or the essence of work, assumed in its laborious quality, and the qualification of worker. We must be precise about this. The worker can be sovereign if he desires to be so, but only to the extent to which he lays down his tools. Let us move on. Now, this is the whole productivity thesis that you see in Bataille, which a lot of grad students like. But I think there is a fundamental thing to tie in back to this view of sovereignty. It is a contradiction of the proletariat itself that Marx hints at in Capital. The proletariat is free labor, thus is free to make decisions about laboring, and thus is in a fundamentally different condition than the slave. And this even shows up economically. The slave is considered a form of fixed capital, like a machine. It is thingified. And I use it there because that's implied in the thingification. The slave is rendered non-human. The worker is both rendered non-human and not at the same time. The worker is a form of variable capital because you can exploit them more or less. The only minimum is what you can get away with in their subsistence. However, there are pushbacks, and that changes the variable of profit. Whereas competition will drive down things to cost, and fixed capital, even though it is cheaper in the short run, will have costs that can't be overcome. Variable capital can be manipulated. But what makes variable capital capital? Variable capital futures, as in outputs from work, can be traded as futures on the market. So this leads to a fundamental contradiction of which the proletariat not just is involved in, but literally embodies and is for Marx. The proletariat is alienated from their labor, but they are free. They own themselves. And in some sense, they are sovereign in the workforce. And that's where Marx actually talking about unfair labor practices is actually somewhat beside the point. Believe it or not, Marx does say that. That's not the issue. At least not for Marx. The issue is that it's an impossible position to be in because one's future, one's labor power is traded on the market. So even though one is free to work and working is what defines oneself, and one is sovereign in that decision, one does not own the products of one's labor or their labor power, which can be traded as a commodity on the market. It is a form of variable capital, which they do not own. So the labor is both free and does not own themselves, but also is owned by the thing in which they do labor power and thus removed from them. They aren't just part of a contradiction between themselves and the capitalists. They are a contradiction in themselves. Now, Marx wasn't thinking about sovereignty in Hobbesian terms, but Bataille, in this French way that it kind of always annoys me, but this one's actually illustrative, ties this back into the worker as sovereign. If the worker can be sovereign, when the worker is sovereign, the worker just doesn't work. But then society can't purport to continue existing, at least not modern bourgeois society, if all workers do that. And thus a fundamental contradiction emerges. All right, back to the text. Camus himself has left things obscure. So much so, it is true, that they become portentous and irresolute. It seems to me, and I feel very strongly about this, that his pity is addressed above all to those who want to become sovereigns and are shattered by what remains irreducible within them. I even believe that the word pity itself betrays the strength, that is, the sovereignty of such an impulse. This is almost like an Adornoian point. You know, the system that loves the underdog still valorizes the system that made the underdog so. That's an Adorno point. Well, this is what Bataille is saying here. There's a secret sovereignty here that's being betrayed. Even I believe that the word pity, that is the sovereignty of the impulse, that is which is a matter of solidarity, although Camus finds this word too vague and would prefer to use complicity, which raises the curtain on tragedy. In its essence, sovereignty is guilty. It could even be said that in a way it is equivalent to guilt. Camus knows this very well, reminding us of Saint-Just's words, "No one can rule innocently," basically because rulership is violence and graft and corruption and blah, 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 but it's because that's what maintains the society of law. This remains ambiguous if one understands the question of ruling in the vulgar sense of governing, but sovereignty resides in crime just as its divine and majestic humors do, being, like revolt, above all laws. Saint-Just postulates that it is axiomatic that all kings are rebels. Is not the sovereignty the fact that one would prefer to die, or at least to place one's own life on the line, rather than submit to the weight that overwhelms man? The sovereign is sovereign because the sovereign was willing to die, and it's granted you your life. Go back to the Hobbes we just read. Believe it or not, Bataille is on to something here. At its most extreme limit, this weight is not simply servitude or suffering, but death. Like Albert Camus, we ourselves can rebel against death, but who cannot recognize that there is a revolt, first of all, a particular will towards excess, and that one cannot extract restraint from sovereignty. This was even the affliction of sovereignty at the extreme of wanting to protect the sovereign existence of the king from death, even if it implies more than the vain counterpart of this glaring truth. Every king, says Camus, is guilty by the fact that he wants to be king, and is not thereby consecrated to death. In the same way, the modern rebel exists in crime. He kills, but in his turn accepts that his crime consecrates him to death. He accepts dying and paying for his life with a life. In human terms, there is a curse on all sovereignty, as on all revolt. Anyone who cannot submit must pay, for he is guilty. These archaic terms cannot be the final word. Mankind's innocence can never be really definitely lost, but sovereign life, as it responds to desire to be an end in itself without any expectations, without a means to other ends being subordinated, needs to take guilt and retribution to itself. Writings on Surrealism. Subsection, or S is specific sub-essay. What is it again? I said in the beginning, but I have to make sure I get it right. The Age of Revolt, which is, of course, a reflection on Camus' book of the same name, or maybe Resistance, Rebellion, and Death, actually, that he's writing about here, which I read in high school and haven't read since then. And this is from The Absence of Myth by George Bataille. And by the way, this whole sovereignty and treating the person as a thing, as an actual threat, this is also a concern of Foucault in Discipline and Punish, and why Foucault actually strongly implies that sovereign cruelty is actually preferable to the episteme of liberal administrative justice. Now, we can go back and forth on that romanticism. I don't have a whole lot of time for it, but it is what these people believed. When we ask ourselves this today, what does it say about the era of the divided government against itself and the extreme administrative state that has come to administer that divided government? When there's 50 different governments in the United States, which have odds, you pay different taxation levels to them. It's something Europeans often don't understand. When they talk about Americans and how we have such last tax rates, Americans don't understand this because they're only looking at national tax rates. They're not looking at the various federal and municipal levels. And it's not like there aren't provincial and municipal taxes in Europe or Britain, but not at the level we have in the United States. We basically fund individual sovereign governments who are not actually sovereign, though, because they're under the jurisdiction of U.S. law, where all the administration of civil life is in their jurisdiction, but all the administration of entitlements and violence is in the jurisdictions of the federal government, which has currency sovereignty, which these small states do not. This question of sovereignty becomes a key thing to look at. In the age of Biden or the age of Trump, as the administrative state increasingly becomes seemingly incompetent or too divided or complex to function for itself either, and thus revolts against it are more and more common. But how do these things manifest? I use the term one-upped and dystopic, and I'm writing a whole book about this. Or, grift-topic, not dystopic. Wontopia is the non-existent world of public policy ran primarily by bureaucrats who have a light hand, but are still in a highly bureaucratic apparatus. The vision of Kaczynski and Obama is in actual practice. It's just a change in the way of administrating the state, and a change in the function and administration of quote neoliberalism. But this means you are empowering hidden agencies to act as sovereign in the fragmentations of things. So while I'm not here to say that everything Hobbes argues is good. I actually believe that overly centralized states are given towards cascade failure. They're fragile. They break down. But they are a normal response to overly complicated systems, which are fractious and even violent, of which Hobbes lived through such a time. So this is not so much for me to do an apologia for Hobbes, but to say that Hobbes's concept of sovereignty it leads to interesting problems. And if we take it at its face, the criminal is also a sovereign, and Bataille is right about that. Do with that what you will. Remember, it's your responsibility to use what we learn here. Punditry is about hopes and fears and political aesthetics. And whether it's big mustache guy aesthetics with the commie flags, or eagles and rather gauche, ugly suits and gold sneakers. But the social reproduction function of society requires an aesthetics, and the aesthetics, however, is a ruse for both the sovereign and the sovereign's relationship to violence. When we often cannot assert our own sovereignty as either criminals or as sovereigns, and cannot participate in that sovereignty in a meaningful way, we often project that elsewhere. Now, I think one of the fundamental problems of both these notions is that we do not actually exist in a world without obligation, and our obligations are more than to ourselves, thus undoing both Hobbes and Bataille. But if we take the human atomization as a given, the sovereignty focus seems to be a result of it. Anyway, think about it. Protect your peace, like and subscribe, and don't whine. Think. Take care.